Disinformation knows no borders, and today the stakes seem higher than ever. Welcome to TruthTalks, a brave new podcast series tackling the challenges of fake news and propaganda head-on. Join us for engaging short conversations with experts from all EU member states and Ukraine as we uncover the truth behind dominant disinformation trends and explore the strategies shaping Europe's fight against manipulation. In this episode, we are zooming in on Sweden. Our guest today is Patrik Oksanen, resident senior fellow at the Stockholm Freeworld Forum think tank, but also associated with Swedish Defence University. Patrik is also a member of the Royal Academy of War Sciences. Welcome.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to join the conversation.
You will publish a book in April about Russian hybrid warfare against Sweden in particular. So let me start with a question. What are the major actors active in Sweden in terms of disinformation, if it's just Russia?
Well, it's not just Russia. When we look at the threat landscape in Sweden from state actors, the Swedish security police talks about three countries: Russia, People's Republic of China, and Iran. And here I would say that what we have seen in the last couple of years, they have been all active, but of course Russia is the most active country in Sweden and have been doing that for the longest time, but it's not just Russia.
Okay, so you are mentioning that the volume of disinformation warfare is the highest from the side of Russia, but there are also these two other actors. Is it just a difference in volume or also in scope, in themes, in goals? How do you see that?
You could describe it as that Russia has the most goals and aiming deepest into society. If you look at Iran, they have an interest in for example, increasing pressure on Israel and using Sweden as a battlefield. And here you have seen also that they have been acting also around the Quran burnings. The Iranians, for example, they hacked the Swedish text message service that sent out around 10,000 text messages to Swedish mobile phones, and the message there was to go after the Quran burners. So you can see some different angles there. China, that is around interest things for China. You saw it around the pandemic, for example, and also that you saw it around the pandemic that Russia and China acted symbiotically. And also in the Swedish information arena, you could see how actors that we have associated with Russia also started to spread Chinese disinformation.
Mm-hmm. In our Truth Talks with experts from other countries, we usually hear about Russia. Also this more limited volume about China, but it's actually our first talk when we hear about Iran. Why would you consider Iran being interested about disinforming Swedes? Is it about the migrants? Are also different communities targeted in Sweden?
You need to look at it in different levels. Of course, all these actors, the Russians, the Chinese, and the Iranians, have interest to influence their diaspora in Sweden. And that is on one level. Another level that you see is that Iran has been active around the Quran burnings in Sweden, and they are also joining forces with Russia to use that incidents, I should say, both in the Arab world and other places. As you said in your introduction, disinformation knows no border. So you could use one country and aim at one country, but your actual purpose is to influence a third country by using that country as an example. And here, for example, to try to portray Sweden as a Muslim-hating country, etc., 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 and that could drive your points into other audiences, like in the Middle East. So that is an interest, for example, Iran in this case. And then you have the Iranian conflict with Israel. And here we have seen that Iran has used criminal gangs to do attacks on Israeli targets in Sweden. So they have been buying that kind of services from Swedish criminal gangs. And that is also a global conflict that is not limited to Sweden, but Sweden will then be a battleground. So I think it's useful for everyone to think about these issues in 3 layers. I mean, one layer is targeting Sweden as a country. One layer is to be strong for your home audience in order to secure power. And that goes for Russia and Iran and China as well. And then the third layer is that you use a country to make a point to advance your interest in a third country. And I think it's good for everyone to have that picture in mind of these 3 layers when we talk about these issues.
Would you consider any of these layers are more malign than the others?
I would say that the combination is why it's interesting for the threat actors. They get out a lot of it. But then, of course, the damage is, of course, in the Swedish case for the Swedish society, but also it's against Swedish interests abroad. For example, around the Quran burnings, you had a storming of the Swedish embassy in Baghdad as a consequence of that. You had also a terror attack against Swedish soccer fans when the Swedish national team played in Brussels, and that was fueled by the Quran burnings. So, of course, this have effects on a country outside of that country's border and could hit that country's interest or that country's citizens all around the world.
Okay, then how effective are these disinformation campaigns on the communities that they target?
That is the very good $10,000 question, so to speak. There are 2 ways to look at it. To look at one campaign and short-sighted, we can say it's not a big effect. But then when we start to look at the big volume and over time, you can start to argue that it has a lot of effects. Or at least the adversaries who invests in these methods do think it's worth the time and the money and the risk spent on this. And to be frank, it's pretty cheap. It has low risk and the potential is very, very big. To compare that with the cost of building a division of tanks or flotilla of naval warship or a lot of fighter planes and so on. So that is what we're seeing now. And it is combined also with the development of our technical digital infrastructure, which makes information easier to flow very quickly and also without the old kinds of gatekeepers who understood and interpreted different information and could put it in context. And now with a second, you could spread a message globally. So the combination here is something that during the Cold War, I would bet that Andropov, the former Soviet leader who was also head of KGB, he would have been absolutely thrilled about the technology and all the opportunities that gives someone who wants to use information manipulation.
In many countries, I hear also that another type of disinformation producing actors are state politicians. I don't hear that from your side so far, but is it also a kind of challenge in terms of countering disinformation in Sweden?
I would say that in general, Sweden is a high trust society with a high media literacy. That makes it very good in a start to deal with these issues. And we have another advantage here that is very, very crucial for all democracies, and that is that we have a common threat perception in the political landscape. That means that both the left and the right end of the parliament, they all agree on what is the threat. And we have a National Defense Commission that do the analysis and so on what kind of world we are in, and all parties sign that. And that is very good. And just to understand where Sweden stands, the secretary of that Defense Commission, he used to say it half as a joke, but mainly as a truth, that the Defense Commission and the Swedish view of the threat perception is that we have the Baltics view on Russia and the US view on China when it comes to malign actors. And that is very important. When I look around in Europe and in other democracies, I see a political division on these issues. And that makes me very sad and also disturbed because that is a vulnerability. But then a long way to get to your actual question. Do we see disinformation in the Swedish political landscape? Yes, we have seen that, and it has been mainly centered around the Sweden Democrats, the populist right party in the Swedish parliament, and their communication branch, and also they are very interconnected with the landscape of alternative websites in the Swedish information landscape. And to make things a bit more complicated here, a lot of those alternative media sites are more or less openly pro-Russian, but the party itself is not pro-Russian. So that complicates things in the Swedish information landscape.
Okay, fascinating. So now let's turn to narratives. What are the dominant narratives? What are the dominant topics that are most frequently used and targeted by disinformation actors?
When we look at Russia, you could see different phases of it. And up until the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, I would argue that the Russian disinformation was mainly centered around to try to portray Sweden as a failed state due to migration and criminality, also with a combination of being political correct and so on and so on and so on, which is a common theme that I bet your listeners hear from a lot of different countries in Europe.
We have heard this type of narratives also from our Polish politicians, ones that concern Sweden as a failed country, due to these reasons that you mentioned.
Yeah, and that is also what you see as an example how you can use the information for a purpose. Because if you look at what Russia's aims are in Europe is to divide EU and NATO and to drive wedges between allies. And if Poles view Sweden as a failed state, that is very good for Russia. And it's not true, but the problems are true, but the conclusion is wrong. But then when we move up to 2022, you could say it started to shift towards to undermine support for Ukraine, and then also trying to undermine and stop Swedish accession to NATO and complicate Swedish accession to NATO. And we'll see now in 2025, when everything is in turmoil, how the Russian information forces will focus in this year.
Mm-hmm. So you've mentioned the major narrative from the side of Russia. What about these other actors that we were discussing? So Chinese major narratives, Iran's major narratives, and local populist far-right parties. Are these different anyhow?
There are a lot of symbiotic behavior here. To point out something about China is the general view that China tries to make advocacy for its model of society, a non-democratic, authoritarian society that keeps order, so to speak. And so that has been one thing. But I would say that when we look at China also, they have been pretty active during the late 10s and early 20s around, the term in English is transnational repression, to go after both people in their diaspora, but also people in the Swedish debate. And their former ambassador, one of those wolf warriors, that aggressive type of Chinese diplomats, he went very public in various condemnation against Swedish politicians, Swedish journalists, Swedish civil society activists and human rights activists, and threatened journalists and think tanks and so on and so on. And that was in the aftermath of the kidnapping of the Swedish citizen Gui Minhai, who was kidnapped from Thailand and forced to Chinese security police to go to China, and there he is imprisoned, and China does not acknowledge that he's a Swedish citizen. That has been a Chinese way of doing things. And when you look at what they have reacted on, you can very clearly see it when it's sensitive for China. It has been about Gui Minhai, and it has been about Uyghurs, and it has been about Tibet, and it has been about Hong Kong and Taiwan. Then centers very much around China's core priorities for the regime in Beijing. Mm-hmm. And then Iran, they have been less active in the Swedish information arena directly, but it has been using events like the Quran burnings both in Sweden and outside of Sweden, for example, in the information arena. So that are some of the themes and topics here. When we talk about the Koran burnings, there have been different actors doing those Koran burnings. It has been one Swedish-Danish citizen, and it has also been one guy who came from Iraq as a refugee, Christian background, but been active in a pro-Iranian military group. And the first guy, the Swedish Dane, he burned the Quran outside the Turkish embassy, and that fueled off things very badly in the information arena. But to understand that happening, you must go one step deeper. And then how did he end up outside the Turkish embassy? Well, it was two guys in the Swedish alternative media landscape in the far right who had a conversation and came up with the idea, well, let's invite the Swedish-Danish guy to burn the Quran outside the Turkish embassy in order to make mess with the Swedish accession to NATO. And one of those guys were active in a media group, which I go much into deeper in my coming book. But just to give you the short version, that media group is have several connections to Prigozhin, Putin's chef, and various other happenings around in Europe in that network of agents of influence, and also connections with Poland there. And the Polish far-right people who burned down the Hungarian Culture Center in Western Ukraine. So it's a mess. It's a mess.
Oh, thank you. That's a good teaser for your book, but it will sadly be published just in Swedish, at least in the beginning.
Probably, yes. So for all keen listeners, take your classes in Swedish and enjoy.
Exactly. That's our recommendation too. So what are the most widespread fake news in circulation in Sweden nowadays?
That is a very, very good question. I don't have a very good answer on just like that, because what you see is also a fragmented landscape with more and more fragmentation on what kind of platforms you are on. And the pace right now in the whole information landscape is very, very high. And just look, if currently we're having this conversation in January 28th, and Donald Trump has been president for 1 week in the US, and the whole information landscape right now is a bit of like a deer on a road staring at the lights from a truck coming closer and closer. And I'm, of course, referring, for example, on Elon Musk's arm movements during the inauguration and so on and so on. So that is right now when we're talking consuming the information landscape very much. But we'll see what's happening when things settles there. But when we look back in time, we have seen several stories of various disinformation or manipulated information about crimes, supposed crimes that has not been. And we have also seen several forgeries around, for example, one forgery stating back in I think it was 2016, perhaps 2017, that Sweden were selling cannons to Ukraine. Now we're giving them for free, but back then it was kind of a big thing, that a false letter stating that Sweden would sell cannons to Ukraine. And there has been other forgeries as well. One letter from a female commander of the Daesh. You hear how absurd that sounds, thanking the Swedish foreign minister for feminist foreign policy and support. Things have been around. Then again, what we're seeing now in general, I would say that we'll see much more of the artificial intelligence-driven malign information.
That had to be said.
And that will complicate things even more.
So 2 last questions that we can make a little bit more concise, maybe, because we are already past our time. How would you define the specificity, any uniqueness, unique characteristic of this information landscape in Sweden?
I'll go back to that we are very united in the threat perception. That is unique, and that is our advantage. So just to give that short answer.
Yes, exactly. And I think that my last question is exactly about this. It's related to your answer to the penultimate one. What's being done to counter disinformation in Sweden, and what more would you recommend?
Well, what we have done, we have created an agency for psychological defense a couple of years ago. That is one active step taken. We have strengthened media literacy, which is good, but that is another step. What we need now to look at very quickly in the EU is how to deal with the social media platforms and the distribution of information and the possibility to manipulate the distribution. That is crucial. That is not a national issue for Sweden. That will be an EU competence, and that is needed to be addressed. And it will be more complicated now with Elon Musk so close to Donald Trump and how the White House now views EU. So we'll see a global challenge there, which will be much harder. It was a hard question before, and now it will even be harder due to the current climate in the geopolitical world.
Sadly, probably everyone of the experts would agree with that it's a crucial and global challenge. So that brings us to the end of our conversation about Sweden's disinformation landscape. Patrik, thank you so much for sharing this valuable insight.
Thank you, and I was happy to join you.
TruthTalks series is part of the project Guardians of Truth, fact-checking during Poland's EU presidency, which is supported by European Media and Information Fund, managed by Calouste Gulbenkian Foundation.